The ancient beacon hummed to life in the darkness of space, its blue light pulsing across 17 different star systems. Commander Yul Huan felt his ship shake as the strange energy wave passed through it. He had never seen anything like this in his 20 years serving the Kethmoran Empire. "Sir, what was that?" asked his young officer Namgi from the control station. His voice trembled slightly. Yul Huan stared at the bright screens showing their sensors. Numbers and symbols flashed everywhere, but nothing made sense. "I don't know. Send word to all our ships, tell them to stay alert." The beacon continued to pulse, and with each flash, more signals appeared across the galaxy. Old planets that had been dead for hundreds of years suddenly showed signs of activity. Ancient machines were waking up after centuries of sleep. On the planet Verdun 7, Dr. Kirasol was working late in the dig site when the ground began to shake. She and her team had been studying old ruins for months, trying to understand the strange writing carved into the stones. The writing was in a language that no one remembered anymore. "Doctor, look at this," shouted her assistant, pointing at the stone tablets. The carved letters were glowing with the same blue light as the beacon. Kirasol ran to the tablets and watched in amazement as the ancient words became clear. Her translation machine, which had struggled with the old language for weeks, suddenly understood everything perfectly. The words made her blood run cold. "When darkness covers the stars and hope grows thin, the children of Earth shall return. We are humanity. We do not abandon our friends. We do not forget our promises. We will finish what we started. Get me Commander Yul Huan right now," she whispered into her communication device. Her hands were shaking. Back on his ship, Yul Huan received the call from the dig site. "Commander, you need to see what we found. The old stories about humans were not just stories, they were real. They were warnings." "Impossible," Yul Huan said. "Humans disappeared 300 years ago. They ran away when our empire began to take over the galaxy. Everyone knows they were weak." But even as he spoke, his sensor officer called out from across the bridge, "Sir, I'm reading massive energy signatures at the edge of our galaxy. Ships. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands." Yul Huan felt his heart skip. "What kind of ships?" "Unknown design, sir. They're big. Really big. And they're moving this way." The communication from Dr. Kirasol continued. "Commander, there are more tablets here. They tell a story. The humans didn't run away. They left on purpose. They went to the dark space between galaxies to build something. To prepare." "Prepare for what?" Yul Huan demanded. "To come back and save everyone." On distant worlds across the galaxy, other dig sites were making the same discoveries. Ancient human bases that had been hidden for centuries were coming back to life. The beacons were calling to something in the darkness, and that something was answering. Lieutenant Namgi looked up from his station with wide eyes. "Sir, I'm getting reports from all over the Empire. The resistance groups on conquered planets are celebrating. They're saying the old prophecies are coming true." Yul Huan had heard whispers of these prophecies, stories told by slaves and rebels, about a time when their saviors would return. Stories about humans who never gave up, who always came back to help their friends. He had always thought they were just false hope to keep the weak from giving up completely. "Sir," called his sensor officer again, "the unknown ships are getting closer. They'll reach our outer systems in 3 days." For the first time in his career, Commander Yul Huan felt fear. The Kethmoran Empire had ruled the galaxy for 1,000 years. They had conquered every species they encountered. Their military had never known defeat. But the old stories spoke of humans differently. They told of a species that turned impossible situations into victories. A species that got stronger when things got worse. A species that never forgot their friends and never forgave their enemies. Dr. Kirasol's voice came through the communication again. "Commander, there's one more thing. The last tablet has a message. It says, 'We have been watching, we have been waiting, we have been preparing. The galaxy will be free.'" The beacon's pulsing grew faster, and across the galaxy, every person who had ever hoped for freedom looked up at the stars. Some of them had been slaves their entire lives. Some had never known anything but the Empire's rule. But all of them had heard the old stories. Stories about humans who kept their promises. Stories about humans who came back. stories about humans who finished what they started. As Commander Yul Huan watched his sensors show more and more unknown ships appearing at the galaxy's edge, he realized that everything was about to change. The old stories were not just stories. They were promises, and humanity was coming to keep them. The war that everyone thought had ended 300 years ago was about to begin again, but this time, the humans were ready. Admiral Boram stood at the window of her massive ship, the US Unyielding Dawn, looking out at the strange fleet that had come to meet them. After 300 years in the cold darkness between galaxies, humanity had finally returned home. But the galaxy they found was nothing like the one they had left. The alien ships were old and damaged. Many had pieces missing or repairs that looked like they were done with whatever materials the crews could find. These were not the ships of conquerors. These were the ships of people who had been fighting a losing battle for far too long. "Admiral, the resistance leaders are ready to talk," said Captain Insu as he entered the room. His face showed the scars of many battles, even though those battles had been fought in training simulations and preparation exercises. For 3 centuries, humanity had been getting ready for this day. The meeting room filled with creatures Boram had only seen in old records. There was Thexara, the tall insect-like being who led what remained of his people. There was Commander Veltar, whose blue skin was marked with the scars that all slaves received from their Kethmaran masters. There were others too, representatives of species that had once been proud and free but were now just trying to survive. "We welcome you, humans," Thexara said, his voice carrying both hope and confusion. "But we must ask why you have returned. Our records show that your people left the galaxy when the Kethmoran Empire began to grow. We thought you had abandoned us." Admiral Boram looked at the faces around the table. She saw hope mixed with doubt, desperation mixed with fear. These beings had been fighting alone for so long that they had almost forgotten what it felt like to have allies. "We didn't abandon you," Boram said quietly. "We made a choice. We could stay and watch our friends die one by one, or we could leave and build something that could actually win. But you left us to face them alone," said Commander Veltar, anger clear in his voice. "My world fell 50 years after you disappeared. My family died in the slave camps." Commander Su-Jin, who had been standing quietly behind the admiral, stepped forward. "We know. We saw it all." "What do you mean?" Thexara asked. Su-Jin activated a device on the table and the room filled with images. They showed battles from across the galaxy, worlds being conquered, people being enslaved. The images were clear and detailed as if they had been recorded yesterday. "We never really left," Su-Jin explained. "We had spy networks, hidden sensors, secret bases. We watched everything. We recorded everything. We learned from everything." The alien leaders stared at the images in shock. "You were here the whole time?" "Not here exactly," Boram said, "but close enough to see, close enough to plan." She stood up and walked to the large window. Outside, more human ships were arriving. Ship after ship emerged from the darkness, each one bigger and more advanced than anything the Resistance had ever seen. When we saw what the Kethmaran Empire was becoming, we knew we had 2 choices. We could fight them with the technology and knowledge we had then and lose slowly as they conquered world after world. Or we could take our people to safety and spend 300 years building something better. 300 years, whispered Thexara. "Your people lived in the void for 300 years just to come back and help us?" "We didn't just live there," Captain Insu said with a small smile. "We built cities in the darkness, we created new technologies, we trained armies, we prepared for war." The images changed to show massive space stations floating in the emptiness between galaxies. Cities that could hold millions of people, factories that could build fleets of ships, training grounds where generation after generation of humans had learned to fight. "But why?" asked Commander Veltar. "Why sacrifice so much for us?" Boram turned back to face the group. "Because we made a promise. The old stories your people tell about humans, those aren't just stories. They're our word of honor." She walked back to the table and placed her hands on its surface. We promised we would come back when you needed us most. We promised we would never abandon our friends. We promised we would finish the fight. Thexara's voice was barely a whisper. The old story said you would return when hope was almost dead. And is it? Boram asked. Is hope almost dead? The alien leaders looked at each other. They thought about their dying worlds, their enslaved peoples, their failing rebellion. They thought about the children who had never known freedom, and the elders who had forgotten what it looked like. Yes, Thexara admitted. We have maybe 1 year left before the resistance collapses completely. Boram smiled, and for the first time in the meeting it was a smile of pure confidence. Then we're right on time. She gestured toward the window where the human fleet continued to grow. We've spent 300 years preparing for this war. We know every weakness in their defenses. We understand every flaw in their thinking, and we've built the tools to exploit all of it. What do you need from us? Asked Commander Veltar. Just one thing, Boram replied. Remember how to hope, because the real fight is about to begin. Captain Jehun floated silently in the darkness of space, his black suit making him invisible against the stars. Around him, 11 other human soldiers drifted like ghosts through the wreckage of what had once been a Keth-Moran patrol fleet. The enemy ships hung dead in space, their lights out, their crews unconscious. Target confirmed, whispered Sergeant Yuri through the tiny speaker in his helmet. 1 heavy battleship, 2 escort vessels. They're following standard formation patterns. Jehun smiled inside his helmet. After 300 years of studying Keth-Moran military tactics, humans knew exactly how their enemies would react to any situation. The Keth-Moran Empire had conquered the galaxy using the same strategies for 1,000 years. They never changed because they never needed to change. Until now. Remember the plan, Jehun said to his team. We don't want to destroy the ship. We need it working. The Keth-Moran battleship Mighty Fang moved through space like a sleeping giant. Its captain, Commander Torketh, was confident in his ship's power. The human fleet was still days away, and his ship could easily handle any resistance fighters who might attack. He had no idea that 12 humans were already inside his ship. The infiltration had begun 3 hours earlier. While the Keth-Moran crew was busy watching their sensors for enemy ships. They never thought to check their garbage disposal system. Humans had studied the ship's design for decades. They knew every pipe, every tunnel, every weakness. Yuri and her team crawled through the ship's waste processing center, following paths that no Keth-Moran would ever think to guard. The smell was terrible, but they had trained for worse conditions than this. Life support center is just ahead, she whispered into her communicator, proceeding as planned. Meanwhile, Corporal Minho was working his magic in the ship's computer systems. Human technology had advanced far beyond anything the Keth-Moran had seen. While their enemies still used simple computer networks, humans had developed systems that could think and adapt on their own. I'm inside their main computer, Minho reported, beginning Phase 2. On the bridge of the Mighty Fang, Commander Torketh suddenly noticed something strange on his displays. What's happening to our sensors? He demanded. Sir, we're getting false readings everywhere, his sensor officer replied, confusion clear in his voice. It looks like there are enemy ships all around us, but that's impossible. What the Keth-Moran crew didn't know was that their own computers were now lying to them. Minho had taken control of their systems and was feeding them fake information. The crew thought they were seeing attacks from 6 different directions at once. Battle stations, shouted Torketh. All weapons ready. But as his crew rushed to their positions, they began to feel strange. The air in the ship seemed different somehow. Some of the soldiers started to feel dizzy. Others found it hard to think clearly. In the life support center, Yuri was carefully adjusting the ship's air mixture. She wasn't trying to kill anyone. Instead, she was adding chemicals that would make the crew sleepy and confused. It was like putting medicine in their drinking water, except they were breathing it instead. Phase 3 complete, she reported. Enemy crew effectiveness dropping to acceptable levels. Captain Jehun and his assault team were now moving through the ship's main corridors. The Kethmaran guards they encountered seemed slow and confused. Some of them couldn't even remember how to use their weapons properly. "Surrender your ship," Jehun told Commander Torketh when he reached the bridge. The Kethmaran captain was sitting in his chair, looking around with unfocused eyes. "How did you get on my ship?" Torketh asked, his words coming out slowly. "We walked in through your garbage," Jehun replied honestly. That's impossible. No warrior would crawl through garbage." "We're not warriors," Jehun said, as his team secured the bridge. "We're humans. We do whatever works." Back on the human flagship Unyielding Dawn, Admiral Boram was showing the recorded battle to the alien resistance leaders. They watched in amazement as a 12-person human team captured a battleship that normally carried 3,000 soldiers. "I don't understand," said Thexara, shaking his insect-like head. "How did they defeat so many enemies with so few people?" "They didn't defeat them," explained Commander Sujin. "They avoided them. Why fight 3,000 soldiers when you can make them too confused to fight back?" "But this goes against all military honor," protested Commander Veltar. "Poisoning the air, crawling through waste systems, using their own computers against them. These are not the tactics of honorable soldiers." Boram's expression grew serious. "You're right. These are not honorable tactics. But the Kethmaran Empire didn't conquer your worlds through honor. They conquered them through overwhelming force." She pointed to the tactical display showing the captured battleship. "Every species in this galaxy has tried to fight the Kethmaran using their own rules. You've tried to be more honorable, more brave, more skilled, and you've lost every time." "So what's different about humans?" asked Thexara. "We don't fight to be honorable," Sujin answered. "We fight to win. And when the survival of innocent people is at stake, winning is the only honor that matters." The alien leaders sat in silence, thinking about what they had seen. For centuries, they had followed the old ways of warfare. They had tried to defeat their enemies while maintaining their dignity and honor. The humans had just shown them a different way, a way that worked. General Sung Ho stood in the command center of Kepler Station, watching the biggest Kethmaran fleet he had ever seen approach their position. 200 enemy warships moved in perfect formation toward what they believed was the last stronghold of the resistance. The alien commanders were confident this would be their final victory. They had no idea they were flying straight into the most elaborate trap in galactic history. "Admiral, the enemy fleet has committed all their reserve ships to the main attack just like we predicted," Sung Ho reported to Admiral Boram through the communication system. On her flagship, Boram smiled as she watched the tactical display. "Perfect. The Kethmaran always do exactly what their training manuals tell them to do. After 1,000 years, they've forgotten how to think for themselves." The Kethmaran fleet commander, Admiral Vex Thok, was indeed following the standard attack pattern that had worked for his people for centuries. He saw a damaged space station protected by a small fleet of resistance ships. His sensors showed that the station's weapons were offline and its shields were failing. This would be easy. "All ships advance to attack formation," he ordered. "We will destroy this nest of rebels and end their resistance once and for all." But as his fleet moved closer, strange things began to happen. The cargo ships that had been floating helplessly in the area suddenly came to life. Their engines roared as they revealed themselves to be human destroyers in disguise. What had looked like harmless merchant vessels were actually some of the most advanced warships ever built. "Sir, those cargo ships are firing on us," shouted Vex Thok's sensor officer. "They're not cargo ships at all." "Impossible," Vex Thok said, but his displays clearly showed human warships emerging from their hiding places all around his fleet. That was only the beginning. The asteroid field that his navigators had dismissed as a minor hazard began to move. Each rock that his fleet had ignored suddenly sprouted engines and weapon systems. Hundreds of asteroids that had been floating peacefully in space for years revealed themselves to be remote-controlled bombs. Captain Yun-ji, hidden on one of the disguised asteroids, activated her weapon systems. "All units, this is asteroid. Command begin attack pattern 7. The space around the Kethmaran fleet exploded into chaos. What had seemed like empty space was actually filled with hidden human weapons. Every piece of debris, Every floating rock, every damaged ship had been carefully placed and prepared for this moment. But the real surprise was still coming. "Now," ordered General Sung Ho from the station. Captain Yunji pressed a button on her. Control panel and Kepler station revealed its greatest secret. What the Kethmoran had thought was a communications array was actually a gravity weapon more powerful than anything they had ever seen. The device created an artificial gravity, while that pulled the entire enemy fleet into a tight cluster. "What's happening?" Admiral Vexthok demanded as his ships were dragged together against their will. "Our engines are at full power, but we can't break free." His fleet, which had been spread out in a safe attack formation, was now compressed into a small area of space. Ships that should have been kilometers apart were now so close they were in danger of crashing into each other. "This is impossible," Vexthok whispered. "This violates every law of space combat." Admiral Boram's voice came over the communication channel, calm and confident. "Laws are for people who can afford to lose, Admiral. We can't afford to lose, so we don't." With the Kethmoran fleet trapped in the gravity well, the human ships attacked from all sides, but they didn't try to destroy the enemy vessels. Instead, they used the same tactics that had worked on individual ships, just on a much larger scale. Captain Minho, now commanding a squadron of electronic warfare ships, began hacking into the Kethmoran computer systems. Within minutes, half the enemy fleet was receiving false orders from their own command systems. "Admiral, our ships are turning their weapons on each other," reported Vexthok's communications officer. "The computer systems have been compromised." Meanwhile, other human ships were using chemical weapons similar to what had worked on the Yar battleship. But instead of making the crews sleepy, they were filling the enemy ships with gases that made it impossible for the Kethmoran to think clearly or work together. The battle that was supposed to be the Resistance's final defeat became the Kethmoran Empire's greatest loss. Within 6 hours, the most powerful fleet in the sector had surrendered without a single human ship being destroyed. But the real victory was happening across the galaxy. On dozens of worlds, Resistance fighters who had been hiding and barely surviving suddenly found new courage. The news of the human victory spread faster than any communication system. Colonel Hyun-woo, leading a small group of rebels on the planet Zerion 4, received the news just as they were about to give up their hopeless fight. "Did you hear?" he asked his tired soldiers. "The humans won at Kepler Station. They destroyed an entire Kethmoran fleet." A former slave soldier looked up with wonder in his eyes. The humans were right. If we refuse to accept defeat, defeat becomes impossible. Similar scenes played out across the galaxy. On every world where people had been oppressed, hope began to grow again. The resistance movement that had been dying suddenly found new life. The tide of war was turning, and everyone could feel it. The final battle began at the center of the galaxy, where Emperor Vorthak had gathered the largest fleet in Kethmoran history. Over 3,000 warships surrounded his massive flagship, a ship so large it looked like a floating city among the stars. The Emperor was certain that raw numbers would defeat the strange human tactics that had been causing problems across his empire. Admiral Boram stood on the bridge of the unyielding dawn, now leading a combined fleet of human ships and resistance vessels from dozens of different species. Around her, officers who had once been enemies worked side by side, united by a common goal of freedom. "Sir," reported Communications Officer Daeun, "the Emperor is offering surrender terms. He says he will spare all human colonies if we withdraw from the galaxy immediately." Boram's laugh was cold and without humor. "Tell him we didn't travel across the void for 300 years to negotiate. We came here to finish what was started long ago." Emperor Vorthak received the human response, on his throne aboard the Eternal Dominion. For 1,000 years his family had ruled the galaxy through fear and overwhelming force. No enemy had ever refused his generous offer to surrender. "Prepare all weapons," he commanded his fleet. "If the humans want to die, we will grant their wish." The battle that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. Human ships moved in patterns that seemed impossible, their formations changing faster than the Kethmoran computers could track. Captain Wu Jin led a squadron, of small fighters that appeared to vanish and reappear at will, striking critical targets before disappearing back into empty space. "How are they doing that?" demanded the Emperor as he watched human ships seem to phase in and out of existence on his displays. "Sir, they appear to be using some kind of advanced stealth technology combined with micro-jump drives," his chief scientist reported. "They can move instantly from one location to another." But the humans had an even bigger surprise waiting. Commander Taisu, leading a team of the most skilled computer experts humanity had ever produced, was attempting something that had never been tried before. They were going to hack the Emperor's flagship while it was in the middle of combat. "Imrao, in," Taisu reported to Admiral Boram. "Their security systems are strong, but they're based on old technology. Give me 10 minutes. While Taisu worked, the battle raged around them. Human ships used every trick they had learned over 3 centuries of preparation. They turned asteroid fields into weapons, reprogrammed enemy missiles to attack their own ships, and used the Kethmoran's own communication systems to spread confusion through their ranks. The resistance fighters, inspired by human tactics, began fighting with a creativity they had never shown before. Ships that had been barely holding together suddenly became dangerous weapons as their crews learned to think like humans. "Sir, something's wrong with our weapon systems," reported the Emperor's weapons officer. "They're not responding to our commands." Emperor Vorthak felt the first touch of real fear as his ship's guns began turning toward his own fleet. "What's happening?" "The humans have taken control of our systems," his chief scientist said in amazement. "They're using our own ship against us." Commander Taisu had done the impossible. He had hacked into the most secure computer network in the galaxy and turned the Emperor's own weapons against his fleet. The massive guns of the Eternal Dominion began firing on Kethmoran ships, causing chaos and panic throughout the Imperial fleet. As the Emperor's flagship burned from the inside, Admiral Boram opened a communication channel that broadcast to every inhabited world in the galaxy. Her voice was calm but filled with the authority of someone who had just won the most important battle in galactic history. "To all who can hear this message," she began, "the old stories were true. We are humanity. We are the species that keeps its promises. We told you we would return when the galaxy needed us most. We told you we would never abandon our friends. We told you we would finish the fight. Today, that promise is kept. On 1,000 worlds, people who had been slaves their entire lives looked up at the stars and wept with joy. Children who had never known freedom listened to their parents explain what the human victory meant. The Kethmoran Empire, which had seemed eternal and unchangeable, was crumbling before their eyes. Emperor Vorthak, his flagship crippled and his fleet in ruins, finally understood what his ancestors had refused to accept 300 years ago. "You're not like other species," he said over the communication channel. "You don't fight for territory or resources. You fight for ideas." "We fight for freedom," Boram replied simply. "And freedom is an idea that can't be conquered." The war ended not with the destruction of the Kethmoran people, but with the collapse of their empire. Worlds that had been enslaved for generations suddenly found themselves free to choose their own governments. The resistance became the foundation of a new galactic alliance, one built on cooperation instead of conquest. As the human fleets prepared to return to their homes in the void, they left behind teachers and advisors to help the liberated worlds rebuild. But they also left behind something more important, the knowledge that some promises are stronger than time itself. On countless worlds, parents began telling their children new stories. Stories about the day hope returned to the galaxy. Stories about humans who kept their word across 3 centuries. Stories about the species that never forgot its friends. The old stories had become new legends, and the galaxy would never be the same.